Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Friday the 26th of September 2025. This interview, I think, will go live over the weekend. America is retreating, if that's the right word, it seems, into a kind of Old Testament narrative. The headlines today are all dominated by revenge and retribution. The New York Times leads with a story about Donald Trump getting the retribution he sought and shattering the norms of the Justice Department. The Financial Times leads with the same story, suggesting that Trump is saying that other opponents will be targeted, more revenge. The Wall Street Journal leads with the same story about indictments, and also the Washington Post. Trump fulfills promise of revenge. As David Brooks suggested in the New York Times this week, we live in an era of dark passions, and the man who understands that as well as anyone is my guest today, William A. Galston, frequent friend of the show, has been on several times before. He has a new book out, Anger, Fear, Domination, Dark Passions and the Power of Political Speech. William Galston, Bill Galston, is joining us from his office at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Bill, congratulations on the book. Your colleague, John Rausch, who I think has an office up the hall from you at Brookings, suggested that the book is a masterpiece, and I always trust John on these things. Is America becoming more and more of an Old Testament narrative? Is that the story of your book?
Not in so many words. Most of the ideas in my book are drawn from other classical sources, the Greeks, especially Plato and Aristotle. And also I learned most of what I know and say about domination from St. Augustine, who famously talked about the libido dominandi, the lust for dominance. But certainly the idea of retribution, as you mentioned, has figured very, very centrally in the narrative of the current administration. And retribution is an expression of anger, of resentment that wants an outlet. I remember sitting up straight when Donald Trump delivered a speech to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, in March of 2023, in which he had, a peroration paragraph, although it should have ended the speech but didn't, where he says, "And for those of you who have been wronged, I am your retribution." There is absolutely nothing surprising about what's happened since January 20th of this year. I'd say in that respect and many others, Mr. Trump has been as good as his word. And he believes that he has individual enemies. He believes that his movement has collective enemies. He believes that in both cases, wrongdoing has been perpetrated. Wrongs have been inflicted on people who didn't deserve to be wronged, and that revenge and retribution represent justice the old-fashioned way, justice in the way of the Greek Furies before they were tamed into the rule of law.
Tamed into the rule of law. As you said, your book relies on Greek political philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, as well as Augustine's Christian interpretation of Greek thought. Is liberal thought, Bill, and you're a card-carrying member of the liberal intelligentsia, liberal ideology, is liberal philosophy, liberal political thought, an attempt to rechannel those emotions of anger, fear, and domination? Are those the challenges that Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and indeed modern thinkers like Hobbes are all struggling with?
Well, certainly in the case of liberal thinkers, you can find a systematic effort to replace what I call the dark passions with the more innocent pleasures of commercial competition. I mean, there is a marvelous passage, in Voltaire where he talks about walking into the London Stock Exchange and seeing people of all these different political persuasions, all of these different religions, innocently seeking to make money. And entire books have been written on the effort to turn the passions into the interests, where the search for gain replaces the desire for domination. Although, as we've seen in the case of great captains of industry like Mr. Musk, the search for gain, when it reaches a certain scope and scale, becomes a little bit hard to distinguish between the passion for domination. But this has been a consistent theme of liberal thought since Hobbes, if not before. And it is a persistent liberal dream. It's one of the illusions that I try to dispel in my book. In the year 1913, if memory serves, a Brit by the name of Norman Angell, published a book famously predicting that war would not break out because war had become irrational, and it had become irrational because of this vast network of commercial relationships that had grown up among the nations of Europe. Why would Europe do anything so destructive as to enter into a war involving all of the great powers of the continent and the UK besides?
He didn't get it. Maybe Norm Angell, if he was around today, would get a job at the Brookings Institute. Probably.
I don't think so. But
I'm teasing you, Bill. Yeah. Let's go back to Hobbes.
Yeah.
Liberals have always been very ambivalent about Hobbes. On the one hand, of course, he is the father of, I guess, liberal constitutionalism. On the other hand, the heart of his thinking are about the human passions, particularly about fear. Is one of the problems with contemporary liberal thinkers that they haven't acknowledged the passions? Is that one of the arguments you're making in Anger, Fear, and Domination? That Trump, of course, is a master of both manifesting and manipulating these core Old Testament emotions of retribution and passion and hatred. But is one of the problems with liberalism that it hasn't figured out, particularly early 21st century American liberalism, it hasn't figured out how to incorporate or reincorporate the human passions into political thought?
Well, what I'm trying to do in this book is to bring these dark passions back into the center of our awareness. Now, that doesn't mean that liberals can play on these passions, but they have to understand their presence, their power, their persistence. They are perennial. They don't go away. They are part of our nature. And so one of the things that I focus on in the concluding section of the book is how political speech can be used and has been used to soothe and tame these passions rather than arouse and mobilize them. So I am telling my fellow liberals, using that adjective in both its political and its philosophical sense, don't expect these to go away. Stop being surprised by them, right? be aware that they're perennial human possibility, that there are circumstances under which they are particularly likely to arise. And if I, if I can, resist, unless you think it's absolutely necessary, the urge to fight fire with fire. An analogy I sometimes use is what happens at airports when a plane lands badly and bursts into flame. They immediately come out with foam, put foam on the fire to deprive it of the oxygen that it needs to burn. And there are great leaders throughout our history who've been able to mobilize rhetoric on behalf of ending fires rather than starting new ones.
And yet, shouldn't we? I wouldn't. I mean, I don't suppose there's anyone, very few people at least, listening to this or watching this who are great fans of Donald Trump. But shouldn't we at least acknowledge that, for better or worse, he's bringing the human passions, these uncensored passions, back to political life? Is that something that, in an odd way, if not admirable, is not a bad thing? Because you talk about the foam on the runway when a plane crashes. I'm not suggesting that Trump himself is a plane crash, but politics is supposed to be a mirror of our species, isn't it? So why not have these passions in politics?
Well, I mean, you don't have to go any farther than Plato in the Republic to find the argument that politics is basically the human soul writ large. And far be it from me to deny that. However, in the same way that human souls can be in a better or worse condition, so can our collective life. And I do not think that our collective life is well served or can go well if it's dominated by what I call these dark passions. And Mr. Trump has demonstrated an enormous skill at arousing them, being aware of how they operate in specific instances with specific people, and turning anger and fear into the possibilities of enhanced power for himself. Now, am I saying that that's the only thing he's interested in? No. I think that he genuinely believes that the people he believes are the salt of the earth have been wronged and scorned, and whose interests have been ignored for too long by elites of both political parties. I think he believes that their cause is righteous, and that by mobilizing their sentiments, he can build a movement that will enable them to get justice, and before justice, retribution.
Although it's an Old Testament sense of justice.
No argument there. And which is why, frankly, I have found the Trump era to be deeply instructive. I couldn't have written this book in the summer of 2015. And it's been a 10-year education in a part of politics that I hadn't taken seriously enough. And the message of the book overall is wake up. If you're not happy with the way things are going, try to understand the forces that are operating to make it as it is, and what you'd have to understand and do in order to have a chance of shifting this discussion and these emotions in a more productive direction.
I want to go to the power of political speech, of different political speech, maybe the reverse of anger, fear, and domination. But briefly, Bill, to go back to Plato's Republic, you mentioned it a couple of times. Is that the other side of the coin? Plato argued that we got to get rid of the passions. You need this authoritarian rule of experts, of philosopher kings in the Republic. So Plato's Republic, in replacing anger, fear, and domination with something else, isn't necessarily coming up with an alternative. Or in other words, some of the alternatives of this kind of Platonic Brookings Institute or UN style rule of experts which is shorn of all human emotions, which relies on expertise, on science, on knowledge, is equally dangerous, isn't it?
Well, it certainly can be. And it was another one of your countrymen, who wrote a famous book, justly famed book, called The Rise of the Meritocracy.
Yeah, although he meant it ironically, and it's often been taken very literally.
Well, yes, and if you read the book, you can see just how ironic it is. However, the book points to a very real danger. There are claims meritocrats make that cannot be justified. And since the name of my institution has come up more than once in this conversation, the last time I talked to my colleagues, which is all the time, we don't think we should be the rulers of society. Trust me. We harbor no such illusions.
Even John Roush? No, I'm joking. I think he of all your Brookings colleagues would be least able or least interested in ruling other people. What
we believe is that certain kinds of what I'll call practical knowledge can be useful to the people who are charged by their fellow citizens with making and executing decisions on behalf of all of us. And so it is advice, it's not rule. And to be sure, that advice, insofar as it proceeds with this, the scientific method, the academic method, frequently doesn't take into account the sorts of things that I'm talking about. And I am not now, nor have I ever been, an economist. But I think I can say that the concept of rational self-interest is at the heart of many classic economic models. And I think that what we can say is that politics includes rational self-interest, but is hardly limited to it. And I do think that one of the temptations of expertise as we practice it here is to exaggerate the force that rational self-interest can have in human affairs at the expense of the passions, which go off in an entirely different direction.
Yeah, and I think Trump is a good example of that. I mean, going after Comey is so odd, given that Comey probably was the reason why he won power in the first place, and he's certainly closer to the Republicans than to the Democrats. So there's no rational self-interest in going after Comey.
Well, that's what happens. That's what happens when the desire for retribution takes over, right? That you are so focused on inflicting pain and damage on a particular individual or particular group that you don't reason well or see the full picture of what this is going to do to you when everything else is taken into account. And I give an example because I've had this experience many times. When you're seized by anger, you see red, as the saying goes. Your awareness focuses, it narrows down to this small tunnel through which you're viewing the source of your anger. And it is, and there is a reason why so many people, after they've expressed their anger, are deeply regretful, in part because they've harmed other people, but in part because they've harmed themselves. They've forgotten, their own best interests in the name of expressing something that just overcomes you.
Your book is having massive impact amongst the people I respect. Pete Wayne has been on the show many times before. He wrote a really interesting Atlantic piece a few days ago. War is essential. I mean, Pete is a religious thinker. I always think of him as the conscience of America. He's embraced your book in the way in which you suggest that rational self-interest is not enough. Is the argument in the book anger, fear, domination? Does it lend itself, shall we say, Bill, to the liberal religious folk like Pete Wayne, or are you suggesting that if reason isn't enough, then we need to look, if not to unreason, to other metaphysical explanations of explaining ourselves and our world?
Well, it's certainly an argument about the nature of our nature and the nature of the world that we make, insofar as that world is infused by our nature. Now, Pete is a wonderful religious thinker, and in the article you just flashed on the screen.
Yeah, this was from The Atlantic. It's called War is Essential.
Right. And awe and wonder are the beginning not only of philosophy, but also of faith. Right. And awe is something you feel in the presence of something larger than you are, maybe even incommensurably larger than you are. That's what creates awe. You don't have to be a religious thinker to talk about this. Immanuel Kant.
Right, I was just going to bring up Kant.
Yeah, well, he did this. He and Edmund Burke wrote a treatise on the sublime and the beautiful, if memory serves, so that there are many paths open to human beings once you realize that reason and self-interest don't suffice to explain us to ourselves, either individually or collectively. And some lead in a secular direction, and some lead in a religious direction. And famously, there's a text, I think, in Proverbs to the effect that that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the fear stems from the fact that there is something incommensurably larger than you are, unintelligible to us, that nonetheless, shapes our ends, rough hew them as we may. And so Pete takes one path. I take a somewhat different path.
Right. Pete talks about higher aspirations. You mentioned Kant, and of course he famously talked about the crooked timber of humanity. It seems as if Kant, who's the father in many ways, philosophical father, ethical father of the Enlightenment, was, the great challenge of it. The aspiration, at least, of his philosophy, which I have to admit I don't always understand, is to bring together the rational and what Pete would call higher aspirations, bringing together Christianity and reason. Do we need, are you arguing, Bill, in Anger, Fear, and Domination, that we need to go back to the Enlightenment project to remind ourselves of what people like Immanuel Kant were trying to do if we're to recover political language, able to counter the dark Old Testament language of people like Donald Trump?
Well, my very first book, published 50 years ago this month, was on Immanuel Kant. And, it was on Kant's historical essays, and the thesis that he, didn't commit himself to the way Hegel subsequently did, but certainly engaged seriously the idea that there is a force, let us call it history, that amidst the concatenation of events is moving us inexorably toward a better future. By better future, Kant meant a more liberal future, a future in which more and more of the world would be made up of liberal republics who would then come together in literally a league of nations, not a universal state, but a league of nations who would be governed by Republican rules.
And the name of the book is Kant and the Problem of History. When did you write that, Bill?
As I said, I published it 50 years ago this month.
Well, congratulations for being so prescient. Maybe
Well,
it needs to be re-released.
Yeah, well, from your lips to the publisher's ears, Andrew. But look, Kant, I think, is the architect of many things, including one of the illusions, or two of the illusions of liberalism that I oppose in the opening section of this book. First of all, I argue as vigorously as I can that there is no history with a capital H moving us inexorably towards a world in which liberal democracy will be.
So just to jump in here, Bill, were you reading Hegel into Kant here? Because, of course, Kant came before Hegel with his philosophy and maybe religion of history.
No, what I'm suggesting is that the ideas that Kant explored in his historical essays and didn't exactly endorse, but certainly didn't set aside, became more central and more certain in Hegel's thought and in the thought of people. You didn't have to be Hegel to be dominated by the idea that history with a capital H was inexorably leading us towards your preferred future, whether it was the bureaucratic state or liberalism or Marxism, right? I mean, those are three different examples of historical inevitability, to quote the late Isaiah Berlin's phrase, moving us in different directions. But my argument, one of my arguments in the first section of the book, is to repeat that history with a capital H does not exist, that regression is always possible, that history has no end, and by the way, it has no side. So it is not possible to be on the wrong side of history. You can do wrong or you can do right, but history doesn't have a right side.
So you must have been particularly intrigued when Frank Fukuyama came out with his famous thesis. You wrote your Kant book before Fukuyama's End of History.
Well, yes, and I would say that the sales of my book possibly reached 1% of the sales of Frank's book. There's another salient difference.
We all want that. I mean, isn't that because, Bill, we want the end of history? History and the idea of a narrative of history, whether it's Hegel or Kant or Marx or Fukuyama, it somehow suits our mentality, particularly the American mentality, which loves to think in end terms.
Well, but let's trace this to its origin. Many of the world's revealed religions are based on a narrative of ultimate redemption and of a guarantor of that ultimate redemption. And Christians have this idea of the second coming, which will result in the triumphant rule of Jesus Christ on earth. And Jews, of whom I'm one, famously believed, and some still do believe, that although the Messiah does tarry, he will come. And it's the source of very famous Jewish jokes, and which time I think will prevent me from retelling.
Yeah, I was going to invite you. And of course, it explains why the evangelical community is so supportive of Donald Trump. I think we took a Kantian or a Hegelian turn, Bill. Let's fast forward. So we need new language. You've acknowledged that, and it seems fairly obvious. We need a new language to counter the Trumpian anger, fear, and domination. And it needs to come in political speech rather than in Pete Wehner's religiosity, although that's not necessarily a bad thing. So where's this going to come from? You recently did an interesting conversation on the persuasion about how the Democrats can win. Is it about figuring out a way to counter anger, fear, and domination? What are the liberal equivalents to this? If it's not just reason.
Well, it's not just reason, but in the final section of my book, I actually give some examples of past liberal leaders who have used their power of speech, to tame fear and to tame anger, and turn them in productive directions. I deliver a pretty extensive exegesis of Franklin Roosevelt's famous first inaugural address, where he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he says, he explains why fear is to be feared. And then he proposes an antidote to it. And it is a very deliberate effort to speak to the fears of a fearful nation, quarter of the country out of work, democracies in Europe crashing, various sorts of insurgent and illiberal movements and leaders threatening to arise in the United States. And he says the problem with fear, or one of the problems with fear, is that it paralyzes us. We can be caught like deer in the headlights. It can prevent us from doing what is in our power to do to help ourselves out of the situation in which we find ourselves. And the alternative to fear, Roosevelt argues, was confidence in the future. And he thought that his first duty, as a leader in such dark times, taking office in the midst of a financial meltdown where the entire banking system has shut down, is to give people confidence that although their fears have roots in reality, that there's something we can collectively do about it. We are not helpless in the face of the events that have made us appropriately fearful. And of course, he then redeemed the pledge that he'd made, and he moved from confidence as an expression of his own sentiments to the American people to a program that actually built confidence, starting with his response to the banking crisis. And then
Bill, we did a show. With John Roush, as I said earlier this week, Halfway to Hungary, in which John argues that America is increasingly becoming an authoritarian nation on the Orban model. Are we at that point, 1933, where things are that dire that the nation, America, is ready for another? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself?
I think we need a leader who can understand the current mood of the American people and is ready to move it in a better direction. And let me tell you what my analysis is. It's a more hopeful analysis. And that is that there are hard cores on both ends of the political spectrum that are spoiling for a fight. And they don't care if the fight is in the china shop and a whole lot of crockery is broken. But there are many Americans, and I would argue an increasing number of Americans, who are getting tired of constant fighting that seems to them not to be leading to anything productive for themselves and their families and their own lives. And I think that I detect a rising sense that we need civil peace to be restored in the country. One of the purposes of the Constitution stated in the preamble is to foster, quote, domestic tranquility. We have anything but domestic tranquility. And I think an increasing number of Americans are yearning for it. They would like a peacemaker. At least that's a hunch that I'm now exploring. And I do think you don't have to be a Christian, to say at this juncture in our history, blessed are the peacemakers.
Right. So I don't think many people would disagree with you, but where is that parapolitical speech going to come from? You mentioned FDR. He was operating, especially at the beginning, at a time of enormous economic crisis. America may be in a kind of crisis, but as you implied, not quite perhaps as dark or as deep as 1933. Where to find that language? I mean, any Democrat now who stands up talks about what you're talking about, but doesn't it require a particular ability with language or a particular skill, the reverse of the Trump skill? Where's that going to come from?
Well, the answer is we never know the answer to that question until it emerges, right? And that's the great gamble of democracy, that in dire times, potential leaders will come forward and they will meet the challenge to rise to the occasion. And so can I name where that's going to come from? No. And Franklin Roosevelt was dismissed by some of the great pundits of our age, including Walter Lippmann, as an amiable lightweight who very much wanted to be president, and Clark Clifford famously referred to Ronald Reagan as an amiable dunce. That's a direct quotation. 7 years before he became president, Abraham Lincoln was a has-been politician who had served one term in the Congress of the United States before being unceremoniously booted out. And leaders emerge out of nowhere, or sometimes emerge out of unpromising material, including their past selves. And that's one of the mysteries of democracy. I cannot name a name right now, but I can say, as Justice Potter Stewart famously said of pornography, I can't define it, but I'll know it when I see it. And I'd submit so will the American people.
Yeah, it doesn't make me very confident. What do you think of Gavin Newsom? Seems as if of all the Democratic politicians, for better or worse, he may not have read your book, but he is trying to use the power of political speech in a way that directly challenges Trump without becoming Trump himself.
Well, we shall see.
What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and that is that through events that are being rehearsed on the front page of every newspaper these days, the Democratic Party was denied the reckoning that it needed in 2024, right? The necessary debate and reinvention of the party was deferred because of a very unfortunate sequence of events that prevented an open primary within the party. That scenario will not be repeated in 2027 and 2028. We are going to have the robust discussion inside the party that the times require, because clearly what's on offer right now is not adequate, and it's superannuated in many ways. So we will find out in combat, actual political combat, who has what it takes. I don't exclude the possibility that Gavin Newsom might emerge as that person. I am reluctant to reach that conclusion on the basis of what I've seen so far.
And what do you make of this whole endless conversation about Harris, particularly given her new book, and the failure of congressional Democrats to really confront Trump, especially given this new threat of the government shutdown? What advice would you give Schumer, for example?
Well, useless advice that I don't think he can take. But I am one of those who believed back in March when he decided, to go along, that was probably the right decision. I haven't changed my mind about that, and it's not clear to me, to use Donald Trump's famous phrase, that Schumer holds the cards. I think it's a massive gamble that the American people, faced with what could turn out to be a very extended government shutdown, will see it the way the Democrats want it to be seen, that is, as the president's fault. And right now, I think the Democrats were on track to do quite well in the midterms next year. And I would be reluctant to derail that. And so I'd turn the story around. I think that many rank and file Democrats are so angry at the president that they are angry at any leader of their own party who doesn't channel their anger, whether or not that anger points in a productive direction or not. Right? The problem with the Democratic Party right now is that it lacks the power to resist effectively. And no amount of anger and foot stomping is going to change that fact. And so, I think this is a time for leaders to speak truth to anger.
Two more very brief questions, Bill, and I'll let you go. You've been very generous with your time. You wrote an interesting piece back in August of this year talking about what history tells us about the 2026 midterm elections. Have you changed your mind since then? How important are these midterms?
Well, they can be very important. So suppose the Democrats regain majority control in the House of Representatives. Two things will happen. First of all, the legislative agenda of the Trump administration will grind to a halt unless the administration is willing to do what it has not been willing to do up to now, and that is to genuinely sit down and talk with Democrats and craft compromises that can be accepted by both sides. And Mr. Trump's cancellation of the proposed meeting with the Democratic leaders earlier this week is just one more sign of how unready and unwilling he is to engage in that kind of conversation right now. And he can do that because, to quote his saying again, the Democrats don't hold the cards. If they take over the House of Representatives, they will hold the cards. Secondly, the administration has been able to do all sorts of things with no congressional oversight or review or pushback of any kind. And that, too, will stop if the opposition party controls one chamber of Congress.
Final question, Bill, and I'm sure people ask you this all the time. How fearful are you about the future of American democracy? I mean, we've done so many shows on this. You're very much of a centrist. You have a column in the Wall Street Journal, which is a center-right newspaper. You're at Brookings, which is a very much of a centrist institution. Do you believe that there is an existential crisis of American democracy, or is all the Old Testament language that Trump's using about anger, fear, and domination, is it just symbolic, suited for social media, just part of what Donald Trump has been putting on for the last 50 years, the Donald Trump show, whether it's on reality television or in Washington, D.C.?
I'm worried. I think there's cause for worry. And there are structural problems with our institutions that the combat, among different political groups, I think, has exposed. We need a lot of reform in our laws and in our institutions, and if we don't get it, then the institutions could crack under the strain. I don't think we've reached the point of no return. I do think we're drifting in the wrong direction. I I don't think we're halfway to Hungary. I don't think we're a quarter of the way to Weimar. But we had better wake up and mobilize the political will and the intellectual clarity to undertake the changes that the American people want and which are clearly necessary.
Well, I think if we're going to avoid getting closer to Hungary, we need to look at Bill Galston's new book, Anger, Fear, Domination, Dark Passions and the Power of Political Speech. We need to make it a bestseller, Bill, like the Fukuyama End of History book.
From your lips to God's ears.
Right. Well, God is always watching this show, so he's bound to help out on that one. Lovely to have you on the show. Always an honor, Bill, and we'd love to get you back. You're one of the most reasonable and articulate thinkers and visionaries on American politics and society. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.